There's a specific kind of frustration that English learners carry around that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's not the frustration of not understanding a word, or getting a grammar rule wrong, or losing the thread of a conversation. It's something quieter and heavier than that. It's the feeling of having put in real time, real effort, real years, and still not feeling like yourself when you speak. Still feeling like there's a version of you that gets lost somewhere in the translation. I've talked to so many people who describe the same thing. They've taken classes, they've used apps, they've watched shows and listened to podcasts and read articles, and technically they've improved. Their vocabulary is bigger, their grammar is more accurate. But when they're in a real conversation, a spontaneous, unrehearsed, actual human conversation, something still isn't right. Something still feels like they're performing a version of themselves, rather than being themselves.
And if you've ever felt that, if that description touches something real in your experience, then I want you to know that the feeling isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that you've been working on the wrong things, or maybe the right things in the wrong order. Or maybe you've been doing exactly what you were told to do, and what you were told to do wasn't quite enough. This video is what I would do differently. If I had to start from zero today, knowing everything I know now, this is how I would approach it. Not the curriculum, not the methodology, the actual experience of it, the inner work and the outer habits. The things I wish someone had told me before I spent years finding them out the hard way. Let me take you back to the beginning, because I think context matters here, and I want to be honest about where I started. When I first started learning English seriously, I had a very specific image in my head of what success would look like. I pictured myself speaking smoothly, confidently, without pausing, without searching for words, without that internal translator running in the background. I pictured myself in conversations where I wasn't managing, where I was just present, just talking, the way you are in your native language when you're with people you trust. And I thought the path to that image was clear. Study more, learn more words, get the grammar right, consume enough English, and eventually, it would all click together. So that's what I did. I studied, I memorized, I drilled. I watched English content with subtitles. I took notes. I did all the things that responsible learners do. And I made progress. Real, measurable progress. My test scores went up. My reading comprehension improved. I could understand more. But the image in my head, that fluent, present, natural version of me, stayed stubbornly out of reach. And for a long time, I thought the answer was just more of the same. More study, more time, more patience. And then I had an experience that changed how I thought about all of it. I was in a conversation with a group of people, mostly native English speakers, some other learners at different levels, and I noticed something. The person in that group who was the most comfortable, the most engaging, the most natural to listen to, was not the person with the biggest vocabulary. It wasn't the person who made the fewest grammar mistakes. It was someone who made mistakes, actual noticeable mistakes, but who spoke with such ease and genuine presence that nobody cared. Nobody even noticed, because they were so clearly themselves. And I remember thinking, what does that person have that I don't have? What are they doing that I haven't figured out yet? The answer, I realized slowly over the months that followed, was not a technique. It was a relationship. They had a different relationship with the language, and a different relationship with themselves inside the language. So here's what I would do first if I had to start again from zero. Before any vocabulary list, before any grammar book, before any app, I would spend time getting clear on my actual reason for learning. I know that sounds almost too simple to take seriously, but hear me out. Because I don't mean your surface reason. I don't mean because I need it for work, or because I want to travel, or because it opens doors. Those reasons are real, but they're not deep enough to sustain the kind of effort and vulnerability that real fluency requires. What I mean is, what does English represent to you? What kind of conversations do you want to have that you can't have now? What rooms do you want to be able to walk into? What version of yourself are you trying to build access to? When I finally got honest with myself about this, my answer surprised me. It wasn't practical. It was personal. I wanted to feel free. I wanted to be in a conversation in English and feel the same freedom I felt in my own language. The freedom to be funny, to be thoughtful, to disagree, to tell a story, to be fully present instead of halfway managing. That was what I was actually after. And when I got clear on that, everything changed about how I approached the process. Because I want to pass a test, and I want to feel free in conversation, lead you to completely different places. One of them you can achieve by studying harder. The other one requires something much more personal. The second thing I would do, and this is something I never did in my early years, is choose input that I genuinely cared about. There's a concept in language learning research that talks about the difference between input that you passively process and input that actually enters your long-term memory. And the single biggest factor in whether something enters your long-term memory isn't how many times you're exposed to it. It's how much you cared about the context in which you heard it. Your brain is not a hard drive. It doesn't store everything equally. It stores things that were attached to emotion, to interest, to curiosity, to something that mattered. I used to consume English content because it was English. Because someone told me exposure was important. So I watched shows I wasn't that interested in because they were in English. I read articles on topics I didn't particularly care about because they were in English. And yes, I was exposed to the language, but none of it really landed. None of it attached itself to anything real inside me. What I would do differently now is start with obsession. Whatever I was obsessed with, genuinely, privately, passionately obsessed with, I would find that in English and go deep. Not breadth, not a variety of topics to build vocabulary. Depth in the things that already lit something up in me. Because when you're listening to something you genuinely care about, you're not managing the language. You're not sitting slightly outside the experience, tracking how much you understand. You're in it. You're present. And presence is where language acquisition actually happens. Here's something I wish someone had told me early on, because it would have saved me years of confusion. There is a version of English that you'll understand from the outside, as a reader, as a listener, as someone consuming the language. And there is a completely different version that you'll have access to as a speaker. And for most learners, those two versions are deeply out of sync. Comprehension runs years ahead of production. You can understand conversations you could never have. You can read things you could never write. And this asymmetry, which is normal, which is not a failure, which is just the natural architecture of language development, creates a specific kind of suffering. You know exactly what you want to say. You understand the sentence perfectly in your head. But the moment it needs to come out of your mouth in real time, in a real conversation, with a real person waiting,
breaks down. It slows. It falls apart.
For a long time, I thought this was a vocabulary problem. I thought if I just knew more words, the production would catch up. But that wasn't it. The problem wasn't vocabulary. The problem was that I had almost no practice producing. I had consumed for years and barely produced at all. So the third thing I would do, and I would start this embarrassingly early before I felt ready, is produce constantly. Talk to myself. Record voice memos in English. Write small journals. Describe my day out loud in English. Narrate what I was doing as I was doing it. Not because it would make me look impressive, because it would build a voice, my voice, in English. A voice that wasn't translating from somewhere else, but was generating directly in the language. And this is where something very interesting happens. When you talk to yourself in English over a long period of time, you start to notice the gaps not as failures, but as questions. You reach for something and it isn't there. And instead of feeling shame about it, the way you might feel in front of someone else, you feel curious. What's the word for this? How do I see this thing I'm trying to say? And you go find it. And because you went looking for it from inside your own experience, it stays. It actually stays.
The fourth thing, and this one is more uncomfortable than it sounds, is learning to be bad at this in front of people. On purpose. Repeatedly. I spent a long time protecting myself from the discomfort of speaking imperfectly in front of others. I would avoid situations where my English might be exposed. I would prepare carefully before speaking. I would wait until I was sure about something before I said it. And all of that protection kept me comfortable and kept me stuck. Because the thing about comfort is that it doesn't discriminate. When you protect yourself from the discomfort of speaking badly, you also protect yourself from all the learning that comes from speaking badly and surviving it. You protect yourself from the realization that people are far more patient than you viewed. You protect yourself from discovering that your mistakes didn't end the conversation. You protect yourself from the specific growth that only happens when you reach past your current edge.
What I would do differently now is seek out the discomfort deliberately. Not recklessly, not throwing myself into high-stakes situations with no preparation, but consistently finding low-stakes opportunities to speak in English before I felt ready. Online conversations, language exchange partners, talking to myself on a walk, recording a video that nobody would ever see. The goal was never to be perfect in those moments. The goal was to shrink the gap between the version of me that existed in my head and the version of me that actually showed up in conversation. And the only way to shrink that gap is to keep crossing it.
Something I realized, and this took me longer than I want to admit, is that the emotional state you're in when you practice matters enormously. I used to practice English from a place of anxiety. Every speaking attempt was a test. Every conversation was evidence. If it went well, I was doing okay. If it went badly, I was failing. And that constant evaluation, that constant self-monitoring, that background hum of judgment, it made everything harder. It made me slower. It made me less present. It made the practice itself something I wanted to avoid. There's a phrase I came across at some point. The idea that you can't learn well when you're in a state of threat. And when I read that, something clicked for me. Because every time I sat down to practice English, I had created a state of threat. The threat of being judged. The threat of confirming my fear that I wasn't good enough. The threat of looking stupid. And my brain, in a state of threat, was not open. It was defended. And defended people don't take in new information easily. The shift that helped me more than almost anything else was changing the emotional context of my practice, removing the evaluation, making it play, making it something I did because I was curious,
because I was interested, because I wanted to, not because I was trying to prove something. And I realize this sounds abstract, but practically it looked like this. I stopped asking myself after every practice session whether I had done well. I started asking instead whether I had been present, whether I had been engaged, whether I had followed my curiosity somewhere interesting. And those questions led to a completely different quality of practice. The fifth thing I would do is invest deeply in my inner life in English. Not just my English, my inner life in English. Let me explain what I mean by this. There's a kind of fluency that's transactional. You can order coffee, book a hotel, give a presentation, write a professional email, and that fluency is real and it's valuable. But it's surface fluency. It works in controlled situations. It breaks down in the moments that require you to be actually present, to share a real opinion, to respond to something unexpected, to hold space for a real conversation with real stakes. The kind of fluency that doesn't break down in those moments comes from somewhere else. It comes from having thought deeply, in English, about things that matter to you, from having processed ideas in English, from having read things that moved you in English and sat with them and formed responses in English. Reading in English, not for vocabulary, for the pleasure of ideas. Writing in English, not for grammar practice, for the development of perspective. Listening to conversations in English that went somewhere real and interesting and made you think differently about something. Because language is not separate from thought. The language you have access to shapes the thoughts you can form. And the more you bring your actual inner life into English, the more you think your real thoughts, ask your real questions, hold your real opinions in English, the more the language becomes yours. Not a tool you pick up and put down, something you inhabit. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is one of the most underappreciated parts of this whole process, and it's the question of who you are when you speak English. This sounds strange. You're the same person in any language, right? But I don't think that's entirely true. And I think most learners know this intuitively. There's a version of you in your native language, confident, nuanced, capable of full self-expression. And there's a version of you in English, smaller, more careful, more limited. And the gap between those two versions is not just a language gap, it's an identity gap. When I was in my native language, I trusted myself. I trusted my instincts. I knew when something sounded right because I had decades of experience with it sounding right. In English, I had no such trust. Every sentence was a question mark. Every expression was something I was borrowing rather than owning. And that lack of trust made me hesitant in a way that had nothing to do with vocabulary or grammar. What I would do differently is start building the English-speaking version of myself much earlier. Not performing fluency I didn't have, but deciding consciously, explicitly, that the person I was in English was not a diminished version of me, but an early version of me. Someone at the beginning of something. Someone with a right to take up space even at the start. Because here's what I've noticed in people who become genuinely, naturally fluent. They gave themselves permission to be real in the language before they were technically ready. They brought their actual personality into their broken, imperfect English and let it live there. And because they did that, because they stopped waiting to be fluent to be themselves, the language developed around their personality, rather than their personality waiting for the language. If I had to compress everything I've said into the single most important shift, the one that would have changed my trajectory the most if I had understood it at the beginning, it would be this. Stop treating English as a subject and start treating it as a life. A subject is something you engage with at specific times, in specific ways, with specific goals. A life is something you move through constantly, something that shapes you as you move through it, something that doesn't switch off when the lesson ends. The people who build real fluency, the kind that feels free, the kind that holds up in any situation, the kind that represents the full version of who they are the people who made English part of their actual life. Not just their study schedule, their life, their thinking, their entertainment, their relationships wherever possible, their inner monologue, their curiosity. And this is available to everyone. You don't need a particular privilege or circumstance to make this shift. You just need the willingness to let the language in, to stop keeping it at arm's length, to stop treating it as something foreign, and start treating it as something that is slowly, genuinely becoming yours. Here's where I want to leave you. Imagine a version of yourself not too far in the future, closer than you think, who moves through English the way you move through your native language. Not perfectly, but freely. Who has something to say and says it, who is funny sometimes and serious sometimes, and all of those things are communicable. Who walks into a room where English is spoken and feels not like a guest who has to earn their place, but like someone who belongs there. That version of you is not waiting for a certain number of vocabulary words. They're not waiting to eliminate all their mistakes. They're not waiting to sound like someone who was born into the language. They're waiting for you to decide, really decide, that learning this language is not just something you're doing, it's something you're becoming. And that the process of becoming it, imperfect and uncomfortable and ongoing as it is not a problem to be solved. It's a life being built. That's worth taking seriously. That's worth being patient with. That's worth showing up for again and again, even when the progress is invisible and the gap feels wide. Because it narrows. I promise you it narrows. Not all at once, not on a predictable schedule, but it narrows. And the version of you on the other side of that narrowing, present, free, genuinely themselves in this language, is someone worth all the work it takes to get there. Start today. Start imperfectly. Start as exactly who you are right now. That's enough. That's always been enough. If something in this video resonated with you, if it described something you've been feeling but couldn't quite name, I'd really love to know. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in this process. Tell me what part of it has been hardest for you. If this felt worth your time, subscribe. I make videos like this regularly. Honest, long, not interested in shortcuts, and I'd be glad to have you here. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself out there.